Preface by Richard Bell. The necessity for a new translation of the Qur'an, which would present the results of critical study, came home to the author as an urgent task more than 12 years ago in the course of the preparation of his lectures of the origin of Islam. He began it somewhat lightheartedly, not realizing the labor which it would involve. The task has grown in complexity with each fresh revision. That all the problems of the Qur'an have now been solved, it would require the confidence of ignorance to claim, but it hopes that his work marks a sufficient advance in the understanding of this important religious document to justify its publication. So he's doing work here that is more detailed than a lot of what you can do with the Bible. The main object has been to understand the deliverances of Muhammad afresh, as far as possible in their historical setting, and therefore to get behind the traditional interpretation. But the Muslim commentators have not been ignored. Baidawi has constantly, and other standard commentaries have occasionally been consulted. It would be temerity in a European to question their understanding of the language, but dogmatic prepositions sometimes vitiate their exegesis, and in many passages, the grammatical construction is evidently difficult even to them. Particularly the past couple centuries, there's been a push by the colonial powers and stuff to try to get Quranic Arabic to be a bit obscure to people, even though you can understand it a lot better than biblical Greek. Still, it's in these cases, one must use one's own judgment and seek the solution of the difficulty by methods which they were precluded from adopting. Textual emendation has been very sparingly adopted, not from any a priori principle, but because even in many cases where emendations have been suggested as necessary by scholars, study of the passage has shown that the text is to be accepted as it stands, and the difficulty removed by other methods. There is, as yet, no critical edition of the text available. I have worked with Flugel's edition, but in all cases of difficulty, I have consulted Oriental copies and considered the textual variants recorded by Baidawi. The result has been to convince me that the redactors of the Qur'an must have done their work with great care, and Dr. Jeffrey of Cairo was one who put a full apparatus criticus in the course of preparation. But the translation goes frankly on the assumption that the Quran was in written form when the redactors started their work, whether actually written by Muhammad himself, as I personally believe, or by others at his dictation, which is what history records. This conclusion has also been forced upon me in the course of my work. The translation itself must furnish the proof. If the hypothesis that the present form of the Quran rests upon a careful reproduction of a confusion of written documents, that confusion has been in any considerable number of passages cleared up. The hypothesis will have justified itself. All the possibilities of confusion in written documents have had to be considered. Corrections, interlineal additions, additions on the margin. People wrote commentaries in their Quran things. Like it said that Ali ibn Talib wrote commentaries to his Quran in the margin, and I found prints of Qurans where the Arabic text had comments in the margins. They knew it wasn't the Quran. It's not labeled as the Quran. Linguistically, it's not. But deletions and substitutions, pieces cut off from a passage and wrongly placed, passages written on backs of others, and they're read continuously, front and back, following each other. Now, in the Bible, in what they call the New Testament, in Greek, you have over 10,000 variations, and they're not linguistic ones. You know, that's not, very few of them relatively are that. Constant additions and subtractions, and a lot of the commentators try to just assume that the Quran is full of that, but yet they can't find, other than some dialectical things, some actual difference between one writer of the Quran and another writer of the Quran. Because contrary to popular belief, it wasn't just compiled during the reign of Uthman and then all copies were from there, and you know, et cetera, et cetera. It is to this, rather than to textual defects, or to confusion in Muhammad's own thought and style, that the dreary welter of the Quran, so often deplored by Western writers, is due. Well, if you read some of the stuff in English, but come on, all that stuff about the begots and all that stuff, really, you're gonna complain about other scriptures when that's what you got? And honestly, like, there's not rules or something else and whatever, but and it's more balanced. You know, you have your way out of the hell and all that. All the you know, it arises from the fact that the Quran was delivered for the most part in short pieces, which were afterwards put together in suwar. Again, I incline to believe that Muhammad himself was, to some extent at least, so that one finds the most diverse subjects treated off in the same surah, just as they force themselves upon the Prophet's attention. Where the historical circumstances of Muhammad's deliverances can be recovered, they are for the most part clear and forcible. They make intelligible the unquestioned ascendancy which he gained and held amongst his people. Unfortunately, the historical circumstances are often obscure, even in the latter and better known part of his career. For the Meccan portions of the Quran, we are generally, in spite of tradition, left to guess what were the particular circumstances to which they had reference, and to what was their special purpose. By prefixing headings, I have sought to indicate what seems to me the main point dealt with in each section. Some indication of date has also usually been given, but it has to be understood that these datings are for the most part provisional merely. The thorough arrangements of the Quran in chronological order remains a complicated problem which must be left to others to solve. My main object has been to unravel the composition of the separate suwar, and if it be found that this has contributed to the solution of the larger problem and to the understanding of the Quran, I shall be content. I may add, however, that provisionally I regard the composition of the Quran as falling into three main periods. An early period, from which only fragments survive, consisting mainly of lists of signs and exhortations to the worship of Allah. You know, God is the singular and definitive. You know, so all the Christians, monotheists, people who believe there's Godhead of some sort, they all use the term Allah. But to the Quran period, covering the latter part of Muhammad's activity in Mecca and the first year or two of his residence in Medina, during which he is producing a Quran, giving in Arabic the gist of previous revelation. The book period, beginning somewhere at the end of the year 2, during which Muhammad is definitely producing a book, i.e. an independent revelation. Well, he knew from the start, all 23 of those years, he was learning bits and he knew it was an independent scripture. And he didn't think that the source of revelation and inspiration for the so-called other religions was separate. Now, I know there are spirits that give different religion, but you know what I mean, God's religion, the base religion. The suwar have been kept in their usual order, and only such rearrangements of their contents made as seemed necessary to remove the confusions above referred to. What seemed the natural divisions of the texts have been marked from each other by spacing. The numbering of the verses is that of Hugel, where his verse divisions do not correspond to what appears to have been intended. The numbers have been printed in the text instead of on the margin, and the natural verse divisions retained. Verses have sometimes been broken up in accordance with older divisions shown by the occurrence of internal rhymes within the present verses. The alterations, substitutions, and other derangements of the text have been indicated by the setting of the print on the page. Later additions have been set in a space or two from the margin where parts of the text are printed in parallel columns. That which stands on the left is taken as the earlier, that on the right as a latter substitution for it, where it seems fairly certain that the one was written on the back of the other, a line has been printed between them. These, arbitrary judgments of how they would write that, how rich. So all the difficulty in the reading is because of what Richard Bell says. If I was the one who wrote this, what would I do? So the messing up of the order and all that stuff, which the Arabic clearly exposes as not fitting, and assumptions of issues with the text because some summarized English. But anyways, where it seems fairly certain that the one was where an addition has been made on the back of a scrap or scraps from elsewhere, these are separated from what precedes and follows by lines. Thus, that blanks, all those blank spaces in the middle where it cause confusion, because sometimes the blank space means that you're switching to order and all that. And whereas there is a presumption that one passage was written on the back of another, but a doubt remains, they have been printed consecutively as they stand in the text, and the presumption indicated by a line between them and down the side. Thus, a bunch of dots, or another pattern of dots where there's more breaks in the initial dots, and then a string of consecutive dots, and maybe vertical dots. According as the first is considered to be latter or earlier than the second, short additions within a verse have been marked off by spaces where it has been found necessary for the sake of clearness to add words in the English, which are something missing in this thing here. For the same reason, it has been impossible to acknowledge fully suggestions which have been adopted from others. It would in fact be impossible to record all such depths. So yeah, they're playing around figuring out, well, how would the Quran be compiled if I was doing it? And even though we have continuous manuscripts and we don't have any examples of the text that do this, anyways, before the labors of previous scholars, the work would have been impossible. For help in reading the proofs, I am indebted to the Reverend A.T. Gordon, M.A., whose knowledge of Arabic enabled him to check and sometimes improve the accuracy of the translation, and to the Reverend Louis McGloshin, M.A., whose criticism has removed some of the worst offenses against good English. Yeah, see, that the problem is, because some things are very eloquent in Arabic, and in English, maybe there's some issue. For such defects as remain, I must take responsibility. I have not aimed at literary elegance, but have rather sought to keep as close to the Arabic as the difference in the structures of the two languages would allow. The sometimes awkward inversions are due to an attempt, not however consistently carried through, to bring the equivalent of the Arabic rhyme word to the end of the verse. So he's admitting that the Arabic has this extreme eloquence to it, but he doesn't, yet he criticizes the language. It's like, no, okay. The text. I've also to thank the publisher for their interest and the printers for the care they have taken in a difficult piece of work. It is further necessary to acknowledge, and I do so gratefully, the financial assistance given to the publication by the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland, Richard Bell in Edinburgh, the 17th of July, 1937.